The episode begins within the break room. Helly is once again absorbed in reading the compunction statement, her voice thick with exhaustion. Milchick watches the clock, glancing at her every so often. Eventually, he powers off the equipment, telling her they'll try again in the morning. He walks her to the elevator, and in an instant, Helly reappears, seemingly unchanged, as if the day had reset itself. Back in the break room, Helly hears a muffled voice and asks about it, but Milchick remains silent. With tears in her eyes, Helly continues reading the statement, her voice breaking as she reaches the same words once more. Meanwhile, in Mark's basement, the phone rings with an anonymous, blocked number. He answers it, but there's nothing but silence on the other end. Mark quickly hides in a box of old camping gear, his hand clutching the phone as it continues to buzz. At work, Mark sits in the washroom stall, the hand-drawn map of the office in his hands. He stares at it, lost in thought. When he returns to his desk, Irving notices how long Helly has been in the break room and suggests that Mark might want to intervene. Dylan, however, points out that Mark doesn't have the authority to do so, reinforcing the oppressive limits on their autonomy. As the day at Lumen continues, Bert from Optics and Design, O&D, enters, apologizing for interrupting the team's workflow. Dylan, agitated, responds with aggression, clearly frustrated by the disruption. Bert, unfazed, delivers the new handbook totes to the team and extends an offer for any of the Macrodata team to take an informal tour of O&D, should they desire it. Irving, intrigued, decides to take him up on the offer. Helly returns to the break room looking visibly drained, the exhaustion evident in her expression. Mark, concerned, asks how many times she's gone through the compunction statement. She replies, 1072, a bleak reflection of her endless cycle of repetition. Following Bert's instructions, Irving heads over to O&D. Meanwhile, back at the office, Helly asks about the angry, mumbling voice she's heard, which Dylan had likened to the sound of a crying baby. Mark, adhering to the unspoken rule, insists they aren't supposed to discuss what happens in the break room. Dylan, however, suggests that perhaps Helly should reflect on something she's actually sorry for. Irving arrives at Optics and Design, where he's greeted by Felicia, who directs him to Bert. As they walk through the department, Bert explains the process of displaying the art, revealing the joy of seeing it before anyone else does. Irving shares his emotional connection, mentioning that he cried when he first saw the piece, The Youthful Convalescence of Keir. When Bert shows Irving the painting again, they stand side by side, gazing reverently at the artwork. In a brief, almost electric moment, their hands touch, and Irving realizes he must leave. Back at Macrodata, Helly tells Mark she's finally made it to 4% progress. Mark congratulates her, but his concern for her well-being is evident. As Irving walks through the hallways on his way back, he notices a book titled, The UUR, in an empty conference room. Helly, in her search for answers, finds Mark's map and shows it to Dylan. Mark explains that he believes PD made the map, but Dylan is surprised Mark didn't turn it in. Helly, ever more curious, asks why mapping the office is prohibited. Mark tells her it's an Egan rule. Helly observes that the map includes houses that seem to be outside the building, leading her to speculate that PD may have found a way to escape. Helly accuses Mark of being more loyal to the company than to his best friend, PD. Mark deflects, saying that things were better before Helly joined because they could work without the constant interference. In a heated exchange, Helly holds up the map and accuses Mark of not caring about PD. In response, Mark snatches the photo/map and feeds it into the paper shredder. Irving suddenly returns, stating it's an emergency. He leads Mark and Dylan to an empty conference room, where they find Rickon's book sitting on a chair. The trio stands at a loss, unsure of what to do, knowing they are only allowed to keep the handbook. Mark picks up the book and flips through it, realizing it's inscribed with a personal message to him. Dylan wonders if it could be another message from PD, while Irving suggests it might be some kind of test. Mark decides he'll turn it in to Milchick, intent on following the company's rules. Meanwhile, Helly stumbles upon a paper cutter and seems to consider using it in a more drastic way. When Mark, Irving, and Dylan return, they find Helly has disappeared. Helly, meanwhile, enters Ms. Coble's office, and Milchick follows her in. She threatens to slice off her fingers in a paper cutter unless she's allowed to make a resignation video for her Audi. Ms. Coble orders Milchick to retrieve the video camera. Helly films the resignation video, which is then given to her Audi. The team walks with Helly to the elevator, where she holds her resignation video in hand. The elevator dings, and Helly returns, this time holding a different video disc. She watches the video from her Audi, who explains that she received both the resignation request and the previous one. Audi Helly states that Inni Helly is not a real person, and that she, the Audi, makes all the decisions. She denies the resignation request. Later, at home, Mark is having a conversation with his sister about her birthing options when he receives a news notification on his phone. Petey has died from an unknown ailment. Back at the basement, the phone continues to buzz, unanswered. Ms. Coble meets with Mr. Grainer, who stresses that Kilmer's death was not her fault. Ms. Coble remains fixated on retrieving Petey's chip, to which Grainer responds that Petey will be cremated on Sunday after his funeral. As she looks at a small framed photo, Ms. Coble recites Luhmann's 9 core principles, as though for reassurance. Mark attends Petey's funeral, where Mrs. Selvig approaches him, surprised to see him there. Mark explains that Petey worked at Luhmann, and he wanted to pay his respects. Mrs. Selvig shares that Petey used to come into her shop. A young woman stands by the casket, and Mark tells Mrs. Selvig he's going to the bathroom. He heads to the bar and pours himself a drink. Coble/Selvig approaches the young woman, asking if she was a friend. The woman introduces herself as Petey's daughter, and Mrs. Selvig offers her sympathies. Nina, Petey's ex-wife, introduces herself to Mark, revealing that she doesn't know him. She realizes Mark is from Luhmann and immediately questions why he's even there. Before Mark can explain himself, June, Petey's daughter, comes to get her mom, saying the service is about to begin. Mark asks if she's June, and she confirms it. The two sit down for the service, with June sitting behind Mark. She asks how he knew Petey, to which Mark answers from work. June suggests that severance might not be the best solution for dealing with a difficult situation. Mark, unsure, doesn't respond. As a video plays of Petey and June playing guitar together, a cover of Metallica's Enter Sandman is heard. Meanwhile, Mrs. Selvig enters the room with the casket and begins the process of removing the chip from Petey's head. Overcome by emotion, Mark leaves the service. Ms. Selvig catches up with him as he goes, and June overhears their conversation, but cannot make out what they're saying. She watches the two of them leave together. As they return home, Mrs. Selvig offers to talk whenever Mark might need it, then bids him good night. Instead of going inside, Mark drives to the location of Gemma's fatal car accident, placing his hand on the tree there and weeping. At Luhmann, Ms. Coble hands the chip to Milchik in a small plastic sandwich bag. He begins to ask how she obtained it, but she quickly instructs him to take it to diagnostics. A knock at the door. It's Ms. Casey. Ms. Coble asks her to run a special wellness session with Mark, clearly believing he needs it. In another part of the building, Bert sets up a painting above a water fountain and takes a sip from a drink. Irving approaches, remarking that he doesn't like this particular painting. Bert agrees but seems content to leave it as it is. Quietly, Bert thanks Irving for visiting and apologizes for embarrassing himself earlier. Irving assures him it was no problem. Bert, with 4 more stops to make, asks if Irving would like to join him. The two men walk through the hallways, Bert noting how impressive it is that Irving can nap during work hours. Irving mentions that the handbook specifically forbids sleeping on the job. Bert, in turn, reveals that he prefers the first edition of the handbook, quoting a passage that speaks to the deeper meaning of Kier's work. He explains to Irving that Kier communicates with them not just through the handbook and paintings, but through the very essence of Luhmann. In the washroom, Mark reads a passage from Ricken's book that catches his attention. Your job needs you, not the other way around. Bert and Irving part ways, and Ms. Casey calls Mark in for his wellness session. Helly bids farewell to Dylan and leaves for the day, carrying a thick electrical cord. Dylan, still intrigued by the forbidden book, pulls the UUR from Mark's drawer and begins reading it. Helly enters the elevator, her mind clearly elsewhere. Ms. Casey lights a candle for Mark's wellness session and hands him a ball of clay, asking him to sculpt how he feels. Ms. Coble watches over the session via a security camera. Helly, meanwhile, has made her way to the elevator. Dylan reads an acrostic poem from Ricken's book, meditating on the deeper themes of destiny. Irving heads back to OND and looks in, where he peers behind a door and sees many people working with strange machines. Stay tuned for amazing recap.